Greetings, everyone. Welcome to this evening's lecture. It's a distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. And just to remind us a little bit about the theme for the lecture series is generative sensing. So one of the things that we're interested in is using that as a frame, to look at the many forms and ways that people develop their work, how they read the world, and more importantly, then what they do with that reading. And so this idea that we're sensing and perceiving what's out there in the world and through and inhabiting it through practices, right? So Lancelot Coar comes to us all the way from Winnipeg, Canada, roughly just a hair over 2,000 miles to the north and a little bit east, so just a fair piece up the road. He teaches in the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba, where he's also a resident researcher at the Center for Architectural Studies and Technology, CAST, or you actually say CAST out loud, right? So CAST is the group, and if you don't know about their organization, you're in for a treat, and it's definitely worth more than a look. It's an innovative research center under the direction of Mark West that seeks to, quote, they seek new boundaries for creative thought, design, and building technology through physical explorations of materials, tools, and building methods. And so this question of innovation and embodied innovation through the tools and methods is important. So Lancelot is interesting in his background. There's a foot in architectural engineering and in architecture, and he continues to practice in both. He has a degree in architectural engineering and civil engineering from Drexel University in Philadelphia, and a Master of Architecture from the University of California at Berkeley. His work on the innovative uses of conventional materials, and those are all loaded terms, innovative and conventional, has been widely exhibited and published internationally. Lancelot describes his work with CAST as being held not within, I'm quoting him now, the objects produced, but rather the search for better understanding of the hidden nature of materials, often symbolized but rarely understood. And this brought to mind Buckminster Fuller, and by extension Anne Ting, but that's another conversation, and something he said in 1970, making the world's available resources serve 100% of the exploding population can only be accomplished by boldly accelerated design revolution to increase present performance per unit of invested resources. This is a task for radical technical innovations, not political voodoo men. Lancelot fosters this sense of radical innovation in his work and also in those around him. So please join me in welcoming Lancelot to Lubbock.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you very much for the very nice introduction. And thank you and Josh, and especially I'd like to say thank you to Victoria for an amazing tour today. I've been here for the last 3 years, actually, very generously from the school here, and I'm very grateful for these visits. And I was just saying to Victoria today that although this is the third time, I feel like every time is the first because I come back with more curiosity and more speculation than I had the time previous. And you'll actually be seeing a few images that we took from today's trip, which we left at literally the crack of dawn today. And we covered quite a lot of ground. So I'm thrilled to be able to kind of incorporate some of those images to today's lecture. There's a lot I'd like to sort of say off the cuff, but I've actually decided that I'm going to just dive right into the talk. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to split the talk into 2 sections. The first section is going to describe a bit of a sort of a conceptual, theoretical foundation for a lot of the work that you're going to see in the second half. And the second half is the practice of the ideas. And I think that this is a really important concept to be understood in the context of situating ideas within the world. This is something we talk about a lot in the academy, right? I mean, we discuss the ideas about concept, background, ideas, you know, how have you come up with work? Who are you looking at? What type of direction is this going? And so forth. This idea that somehow we have to have God's eye at the beginning of a project and know immediately where it's going. I'm actually going to argue for a reverse method, and I'll hope to explain that in the first half and then show how at least I try to practice that in the second half. I would like to start with an observation of a growing rift that I see between the way we use materials and the meaning they carry in the things we build. A trend that presents a potential loss of meaning in our work, both to us as well as to the culture that springs out of the buildings and cities that we are creating. If we consider the chronological layer cake of most industrialized cities of North America, for example, slicing a section from the hard inner core of the turn-of-the-century industrialized areas to the newest and boldest suburban developments on these edges of our metropolitan area, we can find a tectonic and anthropological study of the relationship between materials, construction practices, and the cultural priorities associated with each strata. Beginning in the industrial section, containing the oldest buildings in the city, most structures are made up of solid, load-bearing masonry walls, structural timber supporting robust wood plank flooring, and articulated detailing on the interior, allowing precious light to penetrate deep into the spaces beyond the thick walls, with the use of transom lights and glass walls that are still standing in unrenovated spaces. As well near the city, we find turn-of-the-century homes built for those who worked in these industrialized warehouses, made with early old-growth lumber that still maintains the dimensions and the names that they are called by. A 2x4 is still a 2x4 and sometimes more. Bricks still hold up the joists of the floors of the roof above. Wood frames in homes often rise several floors in a single breath, proudly flaunting the vast dimensions that they were readily available with when they were erected. Plaster details and exposed straight grain wood trim, wood paneled wainscoting, solid functional fireplaces all describe an attention to the pleasures of the interior that was a basic concern for even the most modest of homes. Moving slightly outwards, we find early multi-story office buildings and high-rises that reveal that the masonry has shifted from being a material that has supported a structural envelope to one that is held up by a hidden skeleton of steel and concrete. Bricks now simply support themselves, while the interior is looked after by a hidden structure that is decorated with gypsum panels, stone tiles, and a wood veneer. Cutting a bit deeper into the cake, we find homes and buildings that are rising faster and in greater quantity at the same time. Homes are now made with shorter dimensional lumber, the stones and bricks are thinner, and yet the volume is somehow increasing like an inflating balloon. Further yet, we begin to find that homes are no longer being built with individual wood members, but are now composite pieces made up of scraps of pressed pieces and formed into single members, reflecting the shapes of materials found only years earlier. These new Frankenstructures help to span greater distances at cheaper costs with less supports faster. Bricks are carved from stucco, faux finished veneers, and imitation plastic timber patios now pepper the blooming suburbs like chocolate sprinkles on our beloved layer cake. Of course, this gross simplification and biased critique of our design and building trade neglects to raise many important factors, including global access to skilled trades and labor, rapidly evolving technologies, and availability and quality of materials, and the social and cultural and political influences that explain, but not excuse, much of what has become of our city form. The implication of this trend, however, is not only about architecture and a nostalgic memory of it, but I'm speaking as well to our cultural linkage to the deeply rooted primordial kinship of the nature of materials and the meaning they have in the life of what we build. And in a way, what I'm talking about is a relationship between the idea of inherited knowledge versus experiential knowledge. The question I would probably pose to each of you is, if I were to ask you to separate what you think you know from things you've actually experienced to things you've actually inherited by reading or hearing from others, could you do it? And if you could, what would that look like? I would argue that the two have become intermeshed, and we've actually begun to lose the ability to understand what we've actually come to experience in the world on our own, in our own personal way, versus the things that we've come to accept blindly because of the ideas of predecessors before us. Both are incredibly important, but both have a role, and that's what I'm talking about today. I'm interested in the authenticity of what we perceive and the importance that that has with the curiosity that can foster in each of us. The curiosity about the things we're designing and the things that we end up making in the world. In a way, I guess this would describe a concern also about the idea that we are beginning to move from an innate ability to have an intuitive sense about the things we make and an understanding of them through that intuition to an understanding of things strictly through the production and consumption of things. And very often the things that we produce and consume in the world are actually not designed or produced by us, but are in fact things that we begin to take on through appropriation, through the idea of inheritance of ideas. The Industrial Revolution was incredibly earth-shaking on many levels, but specifically to the roots of design. Previous to that, the arts and crafts movement, which was a pull against the Industrial Revolution at the very forefront of it, the idea of making was where a craftsperson would actually hone an object, a material, down through its phases all the way to an object that is actually finished. And there's a process where design and making is often a conversation that's mysterious and strange and cannot be described on paper. It can't be described in the object as we see it in the end. Very often the experience of the maker cannot describe the thing that they're doing simply through what is made. And now, as well, the Industrial Revolution, as a result, has taken that maker and separated them from the design process. The maker now works specifically with the idea of representation and instruction given by the designer, who actually doesn't have direct contact with the materials that they're designing. So now we have a difference in experience, two separate sets of experience that don't have the opportunity to collaborate through design and through making. The Swiss engineer, Robert Maillard, condemns this split. He condemns the split of designing and making, and he used to describe to engineers that he would teach as well that the only way to actually understand a structure is not by devising a way to break up its constituent parts and to analyze these parts individually, but to actually look at it as a comprehensive whole, to study the behavior, that was a new term, the behavior of the structure. What he said was that this helps to lead to the direct experience with the idea and the thing that is being made, and that this can also lead to a, quote, sympathetic understanding of the structures that they're designing. Now, if you think about this for a minute, the way that we typically talk about engineering is quite disparate from this way of talking about sympathy, empathy. These things are not in our lexicon today. David Bohm, a British physicist and philosopher, used to say that the engagement, the physical engagement with the material, transforms understanding through physical sensations, muscular reactions, memory, and emotions. It's through these experiences that actually transforms the way that we perceive the world on our own terms. So what Bohm is saying is that actually through our physical contact with things that we make, it transforms our understanding of them, and we can't help that. And we can't describe that, and most importantly, we can't predict that. So the idea of understanding and intuition that comes from that is something that is only experienced through the act of doing. Michel de Certeau describes that tactics, if you will, are the way that people can innately interpret and reappropriate the world on their own terms. And this is a creative act. The idea of organizing through tactics reappropriation of the world, the things in it, the things that we see through the experiences we have with them, is something that is unplanned and informal. He describes these tactics as, quote, wandering lines as well. These wandering lines create spontaneous interpretations of the things in the world and the connections that we make through them. This is not so dissimilar, of course, from the Situationists International, the psychogeographical mappings that were, of course, proposed that we all probably know very well. But I think that this is a very interesting correlation here, because the idea that a mapping of something through an experience of it that can only be understood by the person who's experiencing it has the task to represent that somehow through an object. These psychogeographic mappings are not meant to be understood in one line or in the same way by multiple people viewing it. The creative act is, what I would argue, a marriage of intuition and active interpretation of experience. And this doesn't have to be done through high design or through complex, rigorous training. This happens innately in every one of us. And this is something that I think is better to be showing through an example than maybe through words alone. I'd like to talk about G's Bend. Gee's Bend is a community that's located 30 miles southwest of Selma, Alabama. Has a community of 700 people, and it's been a community that's been greatly disconnected from the larger body of area of Alabama, mostly culturally, but specifically through a single road that connects it on its peninsula that only in the last 12 years has been paved. What has happened in Alabama, Gee's Bend, has been that the community for the last 4 generations, the women in that community have taken the fabrics of the experience of the everyday and quilted and composed compositions and fabrics that they needed for the everyday. But the way in which they created them was a direct relationship through experience of generations, through a community, but also through individual expression. And this is something that only comes through an intuitive act of working. This relationship of making, of communication of making, of experience of making through the things made is not something also that's that far away. Locally here, I think it's something that hopefully everybody is familiar with, and if you're not, I highly recommend going to see it because this is a very, very unique place. The architect and sculptor Robert Bruno, in 1979, began constructing a house that he unapologetically described as a sculpture he wished to live in. And what happened in this process of making was that Robert Bruno began to work with a material which was 1/4-inch steel plate that he found at the local scrapyard. And he would find pieces that were randomly sized. He would get scrap bin pieces. And he would take them back to the site and begin to weld them and construct them to create structural shells around the forms that he was making. And the way that he was making them was by actually constructing the tools that he was using to weld and pull and bend the steel, and he was actually trying to position them in a way that began to create a form that was continuous and spoke to his intuitive relationship with the thing that he was making. He used to take the steel plates and use them to attach with temporary welds to the form that he was building, and he would use a hand crank to crank out the pieces, bend them, fix them to the curve that the material desired to be, and then tack them into place and permanently weld them onto the form, grab the next piece, and continue to build from there. This is very different than taking a drawing and building the exact nature of that drawing and proposing that this was somehow an easy thing to do. This was never the approach. This was a 29-year endeavor that resulted in a 200-ton structure that stands now and was completed in 2009, I believe, right before he died, if I'm not mistaken. Victoria and I went there today and had a pretty interesting experience. We found, of course, on this site, which is an informal tourist attraction because there's no fence, there's no ropes, there's a small sun-stained sign saying, please stay away. But underneath it, if you forget to read the sign, there's scraps of materials and the original tools he was using to build with. And Victoria and I were talking about this relationship with materials that he was having while doing this. And so we found a piece of the steel that was used to make the skin of the structure. We set it up, and we stood on it, both of us. Here Victoria's doing that, of course. So Victoria knows, through standing on this, the spring it gives, the motion it gives. She knows by her own body weight, the deflection it gives, 7 inches or so, slightly less than these cinder blocks here. And she knows that, in fact, after standing on this, that this is the force, this is the nature of working with that material that makes that shape, right there, this particular shape. In her body, she understands this. Not from somebody saying he used a hand crank to crank 140 pounds of force to tack it into place. It's a very different conversation. This is a very important thing because the idea of building something from a piece and then arriving at a form is a different approach than very much what we seem to be talking about today in contemporary architecture. Back in the early 60s, Frei Otto was the director of the Institute for Lightweight Structures at the University of Stuttgart. The ILS, as it was known, was a very important institution that Otto used to look with his researchers at very simple materials. He would look at natural materials and natural phenomena with those materials and look at the way that those materials responded to the forces that were introduced to them. This was a form-finding exercise, but this was also a relational exercise, the experience of becoming familiar with how these materials behaved. He came up with a theory that he called the new theory, P-N-E-U, as in pneumatic. And he described this theory as a theory that described all structures, biological, are formed specifically through the varying pressures of two spaces mediated by a membrane that differentiates these spaces. He used to show examples of the human body where the finger, the growth of the bone itself, used to create a form that was also being pressured from the bottom of the finger that's used as a cushion to touch and sense spaces, even down to the blood cells that are being formed by the pressures inside those cells and being pressed against them by others. Here we can see that inside of this, I think it's a raccoon skull, the growth of the brain itself pushes on the skull, creating the shape. The actual skin of the cell itself starts to create an internal structure that creates a boundary condition for protection from that structure. The larger the span, the greater that protection. In architecture, we invariably do the same thing. If you take a look at early Gothic construction, where we're using only compressive materials, what happens is that the inevitable result of large span spaces, even through pointed arches, Gothic groin vaults and barrel vaults, inevitably require us to think about a thicker boundary wall that allow for resulting thrusts that come down on the side walls. So we can't just build walls and expand the scale of things. We actually have to think more intelligently about the skin that inevitably needs to get thicker to allow those spans to take place. He also talked about these pressures not just as physical forces, but specifically as cultural forces. He talked about informal, unplanned settlements that would very often be formed by the internal relationships between the communities in each of these spaces. Here you could also talk about the migratory paths of these unformed settlements or the unplanned settlements, and also perhaps talk about these wandering lines that Desarteau also describes, about a creative interpretation of the landscape and how one moves from one place to the other based on experience. Current studies in medicine itself, osteopathy, which is a very unique way of working with the human body, which basically says that the human body is capable of healing itself through an alignment and a reworking of the tensegrity structure of the internal body. Osteopathy describes that here we can actually see that cells are formed by the tensile forces shared between them, but as well the bones are formed by the muscles pulling on them and the blood flow that pulls on them as well. Gaudí, of course, is another very well-known person that used to take the design of structures and using the gravitational forces to hang what are known as stereostatic modeling techniques. He would hang these chains to model, of course, the force flow of the structures as they would move through. He would hammer, of course, the columns into the ceiling and hang the chains down to create the forms of the barrel vaults that would hang above it. He would then photograph them, flip them, and then draw on them. He would hang sheets on them. He was arguably the first Photoshop user, if you will. So Gaudí used to use photography, and was actually the first person to use photography to propose how architecture might look through the shaping of it through natural forces. So it was really a collaborative effort between the natural forces of the gravity as well as what the materials desired with those forces. And I'm showing these works by Gaudí because the opulence with which he would show the naked forces as they were being supported by the stones are actually the same forces that are actually invisibly moving through structures like this. There is no difference, period. If you look at the spans between the spread here at Sagrada Familia in Barcelona, the span between the supports up here are actually quite similar to the spans inside a very simple mushroom-capped column system like this in a parking garage. However, they're hidden. We don't build this way. We now use hybrid structures of compressive concrete and steel to embed them as composites to create 4-inch thick, 6-inch thick slabs that do the same thing as what Gaudí's structures do. What is interesting, though, is that the question must arise is there a way that we can actually re-arrive at these complex forms in a way that allow us to engage in a conversation between the materials, the forces, and the contemporary needs that we have today? At CAST, it's a laboratory, but I like to describe it more as a sandbox. It's a playpen where we get to explore the potentialities of materials and to start to expand on them and to think about what they become. We kind of listen to the things that we're working with here. And what I was, last night actually, Josh and Chris and I were sitting down at dinner and I was trying to describe the way we work at CAST and probably failing miserably at it. So I came home today and I sketched a diagram of how I think things might be understood a little bit better. Contemporarily, we might describe the flow of workforce in our design methods. You open up a glossy magazine and complex forms are prevalent everywhere. But they're not made all the same way. And this is a very important thing that you actually have to be critical of and intelligent about to be able to differentiate the way that forms are arrived at. And a very common way of working is that ideas are formed, shapes are proposed and generated, sometimes out of ether, sometimes out of the mind, sometimes out of previous ideas that are had through experience, all very legitimate, and sometimes also through the assistance of computer programs, and through a lot of speculation and concepts, if you will. A form is proposed. The form then has to be broken down into constituent parts, and then the question becomes, how do we actually build it in full scale at the place? In CAST, we sort of work the opposite way. We start with a question, and we start with a material. And the question is, what does the material desire to be? In a way similar to, I guess, the famous Kahn quote, "Brick, what do you desire to be?" As these materials are pushed and bent, they actually start to assemble and become something, and then the question for us becomes, what does this actually help us achieve now, here, in a place and for a space? So in a way, we sort of work with very simple things, but then try to build them up into something a bit more complex and interesting. We try to also demonstrate how very simple things can demonstrate complex behaviors. This, of course, is a book that if you open slightly, pinch both sides, and bend straight, it shows an exact replica of a diagram of how a beam performs. The compressive forces leaping up over the top, and the tensile forces moving along the more horizontal application at the base. We can also take very simple materials like this and say, okay, if we introduce a force to it, what form does it desire to be? And soon the material, of course, results in a form that allows us to say, okay, how do we begin with this now? So in a way, it's about establishing a building unit. And of course, questions about how do we draw. Drawing is a very important question too, because the things that we're working with are dynamic things. So it's not as much about representation in 2 and 3 dimensions of impossible views, for example, elevations and sections, but in fact trying to question what are we trying to understand and how can we begin to at least put that down on paper to record the process of what we're going through, not trying to prove anything. One of the first structures that I built was for the National Building Museum that was a question about if these forces that move through structures like this are curvilinear in nature, how could those structures actually become built in the world? And so I speculated that if we were to build the reinforcing of concrete structures like this through curvilinear forms that reflected the shapes of force flow, could we in fact stitch a building together? Could we take it and stitch it like clothing out of flat sheets, stitch it in a controlled environment, fold it up, take it to a site on the back of a flatbed, erect scaffolding around a site, stretch it into place, and fill it like a water balloon with concrete. So this was a speculation on what that might look like if we were able to do that. Then it became a question at the same time as that I began working at CAST of where fabric maybe becomes the boundary condition that liquid states of phase-changing materials like concrete or plaster can actually begin to form, and the hydrostatic nature of what the material wants to be can actually create complex forms. So what we do would be to establish boundary conditions and edges that the liquid could move to and define the shape of the in-between. So really it's about a pushing and pulling between the material and a boundary that we want to introduce to that material. And the results are things that you can't conventionally construct at a full scale or at a model scale without creating expensive formworks. Here the fabric simply pushes out to create these shapes that are very controlled. One of the first projects I did at full scale, testing questions like this, was at the University of Manitoba. It was for the curtain wall project. And what I did with my students is we asked a question and said, could the actual environment of our site, the extreme cold of Winnipeg, which goes down to about -40, which happens to be where Fahrenheit and Celsius meet, which I had no idea about before moving there, can we use that extreme cold to help construct an architecture that we could use as a video projection screen for this conference? So we erected a temporary scaffolding and a base at the bottom and a fabric with pulleys and ropes that we then pulled the fabric up to a curvilinear base that it was attached to and used ping pong balls inside the fabric to pull to with cinches. So there's no holes in the fabric. And then over the course of 3 days, we sprayed it with water for half-hour increments, giving it time to freeze in between these layers, and got to about a half-inch thick base at the bottom, and at the top almost 3/8 of an inch thick. And we pulled the scaffolding away, and the ice stood. And what was really interesting about this was that this was entirely speculation before we started, but it became evident that actually ice is a compressive material that we could use in future projects, and the fabric did become an internal reinforcing system that we could start to think about as well. And it worked very well as a projection screen. The interesting thing also is that the ice spoke back to us. The ice said, actually, the way that I want to fail is not just through melting when the temperature rises above 0 Celsius, but what actually I want to do is sublimate. I want to evaporate from a solid directly to a gas, which I completely forgot from 8th grade physics. But I relearned very quickly once we built this, and it started failing after the course of about 42 days in -12 centigrade temperature. So it wasn't the melting that caused it to fail, but the evaporation of a solid. A very interesting thing to see. In Berlin, I was asked to interpret and construct a screen, a projection screen for a gallery that's in the Mitte district, which is a gallery district in Berlin for a festival called Transmedial. And what I did in collaboration with a professor named Patrick Harrop, who works in a lot of multimedia disciplines, was that we wanted to create a three-dimensional screen structure that would allow people to migrate underneath the screen and inhabit the space, but to also draw out the structural potentials of the 4 walls, if you will, the floor and the 3 walls of the building of this turn-of-the-century structure. So what I did was use the bullet holes as screw anchor points for temporary anchors and eye hooks in the walls that were left over, of course, from the war, and constructed a fabric in 4 days with these long tubes that we then attached to the walls and to the floor to create a tensile membrane that it formed, that it desired to be, and then projected with a masked off screen through one of the windows onto the structure that allowed people to work underneath and allowed video artists to project their work from overhead. This stood through the winter. I should have added some pictures from the winter time, but we actually got about 3 feet of snow on top of this. So it actually stretched down and hovered about 1 inch off the ground, and it had to be shoveled off, and then it bounced right back to its original form, but a lot dirtier. This year at the Southern Alberta Art Gallery, I was asked to build a wall, a second skin, onto the window wall of the Southern Alberta Art Gallery that positions itself directly onto a park in Lethbridge in Alberta. And what's interesting about this park is that it's generally inhabited by a community of people that are usually homeless or unemployed, and so a lot of people are afraid to go into this park. And contrary, a lot of people in the park are afraid to engage the city. So what I wanted to do was to create one of these structures that would allow for the internal cultural pressures, if you will, if you think about the pneumatic question, to pillow out a structure into the community, into the park, and invite in as well as describe what's happening within. So there was a proposal to use ropes from the wall down to the ground, and to lay out a pattern that, when stretched out to different forms, would create a series of tiles held back by rope that would allow the fabric within to be pulled out to the landscape, and you'll see what I mean. So here we set up a rope infrastructure, and it simply set up a beam at the top of the parapet, anchors down to the ground, and then set up fabric behind it, and then stationed ping pong balls behind each of these tiles, and then pulled out to the ground themselves. And as we're positioning these ping pong balls, we're actually playing with it. And we're trying to pull to see where should we pull this to, what makes the most sense in terms of splaying a form out to the landscape. We then used the structure itself as a video screen and used theatrical lights on the interior to project light from the inside of the gallery during the openings out to the landscape beyond it. And what happened, it was people that were inside the gallery, their shadows would be projected onto the screen, and people in the park would be able to see that, and vice versa. People from the park would be hidden and be able to go right up to the screen and touch the screen and see what is actually making these shadows. It was in this project that I realized that these structures are not just objects to be made and seen and built, but actually they potentially themselves could be what might be considered a drawing device. If this is a collaboration with a material, then it is important to ask a question. So I began to ask, if a drawing is about a view from a position, could a position that is projecting light describe a view that is only seen from another place? So here the question is, can I create drawings with the structure positioning the light in different locations? And as I did this, I realized that there were many layers of this structure that I hadn't even considered. There were shadows that the structure was casting on itself. There were ways in which the shadows would actually hide parts of the structure and reveal other parts. Parts would be floating. The material itself became more translucent. Spots itself could, as the light became closer to it, would start to radiate the structure and change its orientation. And when positioned behind it, of course, the way that occupants moved inside changed the scale of perception from the interior to the exterior. So right now I'm actually currently trying to investigate how I could start to draw with the structures that are made, as well as trying to represent them, because it's a dynamic relationship. The drawings are not static questions. In 2010 in the summer, I was collaborating with 5 different artist-run centers in Winnipeg. They had a question, which was, how do we disseminate contemporary art to communities that are disenfranchised from contemporary art in rural Manitoba? Very often this is done because of political and cultural, but also geographic distances that are impossible for normal people in these communities to get to contemporary art. So the question is, how do we build an art community that can travel with a 1976 Airstream trailer? So what I proposed was to use a material I had just started using, which is fiberglass rebar. And this material is typically used in reinforced concrete structures that are susceptible to spalling or rusting. So typically these materials are incredibly flexible, but they're used primarily for their tensile capacity, their strength and tension and compression. But as you can see here, they're incredibly flexible and dynamic. So it really became a question is, how do we begin to build with an axial flexible material? On this trip, I saw that this has actually been done for quite a long time. This is not rocket science and it's not brand new. It is an industry, however. And actually today, Victoria and I went to one of these purveyors and got inside and had a great tour learning about these structures. I think we learned that each of these arms hold how much?
3,000 pounds.
Yeah. 3,500 pounds of water in each of the arms between the wheelbases. And That's just in each one, and then you take that on, and each of these can be built out to a half mile in distance, and you're talking about 20,000 pounds of weight over a span of a half mile. It's pretty amazing. So what I found out was that by working with this, actually not dissimilar from this, is that the assembly of these flexible materials is not like stacking bricks. This is not like screwing wood together. This is actually about a very different way of working. In fact, what it is more of a way of weaving. It's about interlacing. So I started to create patterns that we would introduce forces into, and these forces would actually start to spring the material into action and allow it to form the shape it wanted to make. So these structures, like this one in particular, turned out to be about, this one in particular was about 50 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 15 feet high at the longest side. It's an incredibly long structure for very light material. Each of these bars weighs only 3.5 pounds. It's half-inch diameter. But the capacity it has is actually incredible. So what this does is creates a structure that's not static, it's not fixed, and it's incredibly wobbly. So this really defies a lot of my training as an engineer. The question is, we study statics. You guys study statics. Well, at least I hope you're studying statics. Statics, of course, is the study of fixed materials, fixed structures that are not allowed to deflect. Or if they deflect, it's within a tolerance that's applicable to building codes, that's allowable so that when we walk across the floor it doesn't bounce, and so that things don't fail catastrophically. This doesn't help, does it? Deflection of 5 feet, of 3 feet, of 1 foot, of anything more than 6 inches is not manageable, even by contemporary terms of how you'd apply a structure like this to be tested through a computer program. It's not used to dealing with those kinds of deformations. So trying to figure out how to plan structures with this only worked, at least for me, by working analog with these materials. As well, it began to propose questions about, well, if these structures are dynamic and the site is dynamic, how do we draw out site plans? How do we plan the settlements of these structures in dynamic situations? So what this started to propose was that there's an overlay of dynamic moving, of dynamic shifting, and layering of information that would allow for drawings to be interpreted to consider how a structure like this could be placed on a site that might be drawn like that. As well, trying to figure out how do you use drawings on site, since plan and section and elevation don't quite work. It turns out to be a relationship of patterning and organization that helps to introduce instructions for people for assembly. Since these structures were going to be built by the communities that we were visiting, inhabited by the communities we were visiting, and broken down by the communities we were visiting, it was important that these structures be made incredibly simply, but also to be very engaging, and that was the hope of it. So we loaded up all the material into the Airstream, and you can see here at the back of the truck as we're driving to our first location at St. Claude. We would break out the materials, and the volunteers that would be set up ahead of time from this community had no idea really what they were getting into. They pulled these flexible, wobbly spaghetti strings out onto the landscape, and I had volunteers that were trained to help them start to assemble the fabric and the poles and the rods, and I'd lay out the pattern on the ground, and I would ask them to use rods to start pushing these structures up. And we'd go up and we'd erect, like a barn raising, these structures in a matter of hours on a site that had previously been a vacant site in these small communities only days before. We would add the fabric scrims and create a shade structure during the summer that we would hold art-making workshops by a performance art collective called the Absorbs. This performance art collective would run art-making workshops for the community, usually kids, but actually also a lot of seniors would come to these events, and very, very little participation from people in between those ages. So it's a very strange question, but I think the question of play is something we forget in our Middle Ages. So here, you can see that we use the place for a shade structure. Very often, the tickle trunk of the Absorbs would be something that the kids would participate with, and they would actually be the ones engaging the structure in a creative way. And the act of play is something that is not meant to be downplayed here. Play is a creative interpretation of the moment. And it's something that we can only do when we're actually present. We're not concerned with what we haven't done yet that day or what we've been thinking about from the day before, but it's actually engaging the moment in that place. So children were the ones that actually explored the structure the most. And with the same materials and the same number of materials, we would use different patterns to create different form structures at each location. So we would think about them and we would apply material. We'd add more shade when it was sunnier and less shade when it was less. The openings of the oculus and some of the structures would start to speak to a different type of vernacular in the communities. We went to a location in Peguis for a powwow, which is a First Nations community of northern Manitoba, and this was an incredible experience because their engagement with architecture traditionally, which is actually still very present in their communities, started to create a conversation between ourselves making these structures and their participation in something that they had intuitively already understood. At nights, we would show these contemporary art films for these communities, and the subject matter would be from things that were absolutely fascinating that most anybody could like to incredibly contentious and perhaps edgy films that not a lot of people would understand. But very often you'd have people that would come up and start asking questions about the artist, and this was the point of this kind of project. What was interesting about that project too is that the people in these 7 locations that we visited, which were almost over 1,000 people that we engaged with in this project, they started to realize that they were a part of a larger community. And it was not just about themselves individually, but they were connected to these other 7 communities that were experiencing the same thing and participating in the same events. Right after that, in the winter of 2011, I was building a project for the University of Manitoba for a warming huts competition, which is on the frozen Assiniboine River and Red Rivers in Winnipeg. Winnipeg has the world record for the longest natural skating trail in the world. It's 8 kilometers when it's cold enough. 8 kilometers of a Zamboni path, so if anybody likes to ice skate, you know how awesome that would be. In the middle of the city, you just walk to the river and you can ice skate for 8 kilometers in a tree-lined area, and then you go right past it and you're immediately in the downtown. It's a very strange thing. So for the past 3 years, the Forks, which is the organization that runs a lot of these activities, has asked international architects to propose structures for warming huts, essentially for the skaters passing through. The University of Manitoba was asked to build one, and so we proposed to use this fiberglass as a compressive material to support a fabric that would receive the ice that we had tested out previously. So we did some empirical testing on and some analytical testing on the fiberglass itself to make sure that the tensile strengths in the fiberglass were strong enough to support the geometries in the design. And we would work with essentially about 40 different student volunteers from very different disciplines in architecture, interior design, landscape, and city planning. And we brought the materials out to the site, pre-made a lot of the modules that were made, and started to assemble them on steel rebar that was cast into the ice. 1/2-inch holes were drilled into the ice. The steel rebar was placed in it, water was filled, and the ice bonded to the steel. This created the base that we attached the fiberglass to. The fiberglass was then erected, and the shape that it created was something that it desired, but it was only formed by the people actually moving the structure. What we had planned to do was to use a giant arm boom to carry a large fabric, what I guess I could only describe as a burrito, on top of these needles that would unfold both sides and cover it completely with a fabric that we would then spray water onto. The problem was this particular year the ice was thinner than usual, and we couldn't fit the boom onto the ice. So we had to figure out another way to attach to the structure, and this was actually an incredible opportunity, but we didn't realize it at the time. We speculated that we would build a wooden scaffolding and somehow attach it to this fairly flexible structure, and then work up high, and as a group hold up this giant fabric burrito and hoist it on top. Not a good idea on top of ice. So what one of the volunteers said in the midst of our brain racking over this problem was saying, wait a minute, isn't this a flexible structure? Why can't we unhitch one set of legs, bring it to the other side, and bend the whole thing over? So that's what we did. We unhitched it and we bent the building over. The building hovered because of the concentric shape it has. The building hovered due to natural compression at exactly 6 feet off the ground. So we were able to actually lift the fabric, put it on it, slide it down both sides, stand it back up, and then reattach it from the inside. The building was alive, and the people were alive. The person that recommended this had only days before never seen anything like this before. This is very important. This is talking about the idea of experience not being some highly educated, brilliant designer or something like that. We're talking about anybody being able to touch something and intuitively understand and learn quickly about it because they're experiencing it. They attach the forms They pulled the ropes out. The fabric was tailored like a giant suit. And then a hole was drilled through the ice. Water from the river was pumped out, and we sprayed the sides of it. Ice coated this thing. We had probably over a ½ inch of ice on it for a continuous span of, I think it was 6.5 weeks. And the structure, due to sublimation and due to melting, actually went to a fabric on the southern exposure. It was re-watered about 12 different times through several applications. People would move through it. They would hit it with their hockey sticks, try to break it and touch it, but that was fantastic. Because that's exactly what we're talking about here, is you want people to engage the things that they're seeing, to learn about them. You can see, I thought I had a picture of one of the cracks, but when the cracks would happen, what do? We just water the building. So it's sort of like a chia pet, but it actually was something a little bit sexier. So in this, we have a picture of what it was like to kind of go through it and the shadows that would be created. And you can see because of the light positions, the body is the size of the building. And people were understanding this, so they would move from side to side, get smaller and bigger. In the foreground, you can see a very strange-looking wood barrel that looks like it's made out of chainmail. This was a brilliant construction by one of the students who loved to weld. And he took the way that we were building and used it to construct a welded steel rebar base. It was actually a fairly flexible, but once it was cast in the ice, a very solid wood burn barrel that, because of the chainmail, allowed air to move through it and burn very hot and melt it into a pool of water below it, as you can see. But it didn't go through, so we were quite safe. The experience of moving through it was something that the skaters were actually quite surprised by, some of them, and some of them hardly noticed it. It's a range of experience, and you can't tell people how to receive the idea of things. It's something that people have to digest on their own. The last project I'm going to show is it's called D-Raw, and it was done for the Raw Gallery, and it was done in collaboration with an architect from Chile, from the Open City, named Ronnie Araya. He and I both work at CAST. He works directly with Mark West as a research assistant. And D-Raw is an annual event the Raw Gallery hosts every year in Winnipeg. And it's an event that asks the community if they can participate in defining what the gallery becomes. It's an art and architecture gallery. And what we wanted to do was to create a structure that would act as an infrastructure for the community to define and to form and shape over a period of a month while the structure was up. So what we did was we went to a place called Clearwater, Manitoba. It's a town of 70 farmers, 2.5 hours southwest of Winnipeg, Manitoba. It's a community I've worked with for the last 6 years, and I've done a number of unbuild, design-build projects with my students there, and the community has become incredibly receptive to the idea that materials have potential well beyond their initial perceptive date of terminus. Here we have a building that looks well abandoned. Even the roof itself is in very, very sad shape. These cedar shake shingles are blown off and rotted through, and swallows are going through it like crazy. And the farmer was actually going to burn this building down in about a month from the date that we arrived. So he was generous enough to let us go in there and to scavenge what we could. And so I went with a series of volunteers. Here we're using a trailer we used in that design build studio that we built last year. And we used this as a home base to go inside this structure and to essentially find what we could. And there was a lot of good material to find. I mean, here we have lath, plaster and lath that's basically been preserved like a cocoon for a very long time, for over a century. And this lath has life in it. Also, the structural members that are inside the structure were brought out, denailed, sorted, stacked, and put into the trailer along with 20 bales of straw. We took this material back to the Raw Gallery, which has a wood shop in it, and I, well, very safely here talking on my cell phone in front of a table saw, we're ripping the materials down on the left here to very thin 3/8 inch, 1/4 inch, 1/2 inch pieces of strips of the same length of materials. We took all these materials down, into the raw gallery. The raw gallery is in the basement of one of these early warehouse structures I talked about in the very beginning of these industrialized cities. This wood, if you take a look at the column there, that's about a 20-inch square column. Those columns run up through the floors of this 5-story warehouse. And if you take a look in the ceiling, what do you see but a series of slats? Those slats are actually 2x6s, nailed like this, all the way across. So you have a solid floor of practically 6 inches thick of wood above you. And wood is alive. Wood breathes and wood shrinks over time when it dries. So there are so many cracks in this room that they became the question, what do we do with these cracks? So the columns themselves have cracks, the ceiling has cracks, and the beam in the middle has cracks. In the wall behind us, there is a hole that we put a camera to take a time-lapse series of photos of the process. So we basically took these pieces of wood that supposedly were going to be burned, and we used them as nails and hammered them into the cracks of the room. There were no nails used, no glue, and no rope. The rope that you will see in the following pictures is used because we started getting nervous about the weight, but as soon as we started to actually hammer these things in, we realized that you could almost hang from almost any of these pieces of wood that we hammered in. Previously lath, previously floorboards, all these materials were holding at least 170 pounds worth of force. And you multiply that times 300 or 400 pieces in the ceiling, it becomes an incredibly strong structure. So we started to weave a form that was generated out of the cracks of the room, the negative space of the room. And it created a structure that was a very dense basket that was a vocabulary that it was only able to be, and a form that it also desired. What was amazing about this was that although I also don't have a picture of this, I should really not talk about what I don't have a picture of, but you could actually run and jump and grab onto this thing and it would not budge. Shocking. I had no idea. We had no idea as we're building it. We're incredibly delicate with it. And then at the very end, we were shocked because we were concerned about its stability. So this acted as an infrastructure for people from the community to come here and to add pieces of wood onto. The ground, we put all the straw that I think here, you can see the straw in the background. We used the straw as scaffolding to stand on, to hammer up at the upper elevation of the ceiling that we couldn't reach. And then we unbundled the straw and spread it out on the floor for people to walk around barefoot onto the space, just as a different experience, as a different environment. We also set up a very cheap and gimmicky self-portrait machine, a piece of plexiglass, a halogen light, 2 of them, and black paper and white pencil. And a person can sit and draw their reflection, and they can have 0 skills. But the idea is that people that would come from the community to work on this project would be able to see, we'd be able to see who they were over the period of a month. And you had an amazing wall with beautiful drawings, photos essentially, out of pencil, that people would make of themselves. And so you see the life of the people that are not there anymore. The structure itself, again, acted as the scaffolding. And if you see on the left, there are steel parts. These steel parts we found in the building that we deconstructed, and the shadows that they projected were then laser cut into different forms on the right, and also we cut the proportions of the wood members we were using and allowed people with rope and to experiment with knots and to attach these pieces to the structure and start to change its form and change what its appearance was, and start to experiment with the possibilities of what this thing was. We also put a light inside of it to see what this thing would be. So the gallery opening was basically a shift between people engaging on the structure, drinking beer and trying to hang wood onto a wood structure, and then turning off the lights and letting it become a lantern for the rest of the night. Final stage of this was, what do we do with it? So we shrink wrapped it like a big salami, cut it out the size of the width of the door to get out of this gallery space that was hidden in the basement, moved it up out through the stairs, and out into a truck that I then gave to my students. I gave it to my students at the very beginning of this past year, and I asked them, what do we do with this? How do we return the material back to its origin? That's all I asked, and I gave them this thing that they had never seen, or some of them had seen at the exhibition, but many of them hadn't, and the question of how to engage with this building. They unwrapped it, and I basically told them, because they didn't know how to start, is just begin. If you don't know how to start, just start. Just start playing. So they took pieces of the lath that had fallen off, and they tried to figure out, how do we attach this thing without any new glue, new nails, new rope, anything like that? And they realized that the cedar shake was actually a perfect opportunity for these strips to be attached to. And they found the corner to be a really appropriate place for the position of this geometry. They also saw these swallows flying in and out of this house that was going to be burned down. And they saw how this bird nest had also attached to the corner of this room. So they hoisted this structure up, temporarily attached it to the windows of the house and the interior floorboards of what was there, and simply began by trying to extend the pattern language of the structure into the building itself and try to find out, how do these things actually fit. And what they found very quickly was that the awkwardness that they had originally with something that they had never built before became second nature to them. By the end, they were flying with it, and the structure itself was something that became grafted onto something that it already had belonged to. This is a final shot of the class, and Eileen is hanging from the structure itself, proving that it was suitable. And it was a very strange thing to see. I didn't know what to expect with it, and it was something that I felt that the students were quite excited to behold, because what they had said before was that when they saw this thing, they pretty much thought they'd like to burn it. They thought that would be the best thing to do with it. But I think that this project for me is something I'd like to end on, because for me, I think the relationship of what we do in design is actually an invitation. It's an invitation to people to experience on their own terms. And I think that we have to be very conscious of this in design. And I think that the forms of things we make is only a part, a very small part, but a very important part of the relationship of how we engage the design process and how we can invite people into that process, either through the act of making itself or into the final thing that results from that. This is a list of, actually a short list of people that have worked on all these projects. This is not me, this is not my work, this is about a work of collaborators. And this is, if you look, there's organizations that are from the city, there's people from communities of the government, there are companies, corporations that engage in these kinds of projects, as well as communities. So there's an immense amount of opportunity to engage with the world that we design for. Thank you very much.
Sure. Questions? We have time for questions.
Sure, yeah, feel free.
Do you have that question?
Yeah.
With the warming hut that you designed for the river,
Right.
Were you ever worried about like melting of the ice inside of the hut, because it essentially was warming up that area?
Although I wish I was concerned about the heat it would generate, it actually never really got warm inside there. The name is a misnomer. It's something that I should have clarified. In fact, I saw one project in the past 3 years that actually introduced the idea of heat, which was actually made by an Israeli team whose temperature doesn't go below, I would say, probably 80 or 90 degrees in a winter condition, maybe 70 degrees. But they proposed essentially a structure that was made out of a metal skin that held wood logs that would create a windbreak, but people could use that in the burn barrel in the middle to heat themselves. But for this structure, it essentially became more of a passage, a sort of a thing to protect from snow and wind, rather than anything else. But what was really interesting was that the actual protection from the wind did create a real sense of heat on the inside, which was strange, because if you brought a dry bulb thermometer in there, you wouldn't see any difference from that to the outside. But it didn't end up becoming a concern, though. Yes?
The curtain wall, when you presented it, I immediately thought of the Ice Pavilion by Olafur Eliasson, and the ephemeral qualities of his work. And I see kind of a similar attitude towards the structures, that they're always sort of changing, but they're never permanent. I'm curious as to how if you could comment on the sort of ephemeralities of these pieces, and how you direct that as an architect.
Excuse me. I think that's a really a very good question. I've thought a lot about that, and a lot of these projects are obviously short-lived on purpose. They clearly don't have a time scale that's associated with them of permanence, and actually those are the kinds of projects I'm seeking out right now. These are the projects I want to work on. The reason for that is because I feel like I am trying to understand, I'm trying to gain experience with these different materials and these forces in order to understand how more permanent conditions could be applied. So when we build in permanent ways, in more static ways, one might say, but perhaps we could build in more dynamic ways, we end up fixing a condition that has to engage a range of things that one will never be able to anticipate. Rafael Mineo spoke at the GSD once, and he said that that buildings, once the architects and the critics and the public all leave, buildings must stand on their own, they must survive on their own. And this is exactly the nature of things, is that I feel like the things that I'm discovering about how things can perform, how materials can perform in structures, is still so vast that I don't feel that more permanence at this present moment is something that I'm ready to fix on, actually. I feel also, in the same breath, that there is a cultural and community opportunity in temporary events that I think help to break down this preconception of how one should live in the city, in a community. Temporary events are ways for people to perceive their world in a new way for a short period of time without any apologies about it. With the On the Road project, for example, people will show up, farmers off the fields, literally, and they're going to be building a structure that they get into and they're asking questions about, and they're sitting around and they're putting on face paint, but they would never do that in the everyday. They'd go back to the local restaurant and people would be heckled by doing that on the everyday. But what we're talking about is an opportunity to create temporary events where we can test ideas. And I think in architecture, we have to be thinking about a time scale of architecture existing more than just 3 days or 100 years. Architecture can participate in a range of experiences in our communities that is in between that. 10 years is an architecture, 5 years is an architecture, a year is an architecture, a week is an architecture. So I think architecture is an opportunity to be defined by other time scales other than permanent or completely temporary. I think everything is temporary, and it's just a question of what are we designing for and what are the opportunities in that time scale.
What are some of the other materials that you've worked with? You have the flexible fiberglass rebar, of course you have this wood. This was one of the most interesting because you really didn't know what you were going to find when you got in there. So what are some of the other materials you've worked with to not only understand structure, but then to create occupiable space for temporarily or otherwise?
Right. Well, so far, like what we've seen today, fabric has been involved with most of the projects because fabric is sort of it's sort of a medium to explore ideas of phase-changing materials. So concrete as one, plaster, ice, fabric, fiberglass, wood. And I've speculated about steel, post-tension steel structures, stress steel structures, like Jean Prouvé, if you know his work, of course, from the turn of the century, actually a little later. But he, you know, the idea of bending steel actually to create post-tension structures, actually, of course, like Robert Bruno, has a lot of opportunities, but I haven't had the chance to start working on those projects. But actually, that range of materials is also a really important thing as well. I may focus in on some material in the future, but I think right now I'm very interested in trying to see how there's a universality to a way of working and a way of designing with a range of things that we can learn from, rather than, say, only working with wood and eventually only finding one thing or a way of working with wood that doesn't translate to, say, fabric, or doesn't translate to steel, or doesn't translate to so forth. So initially, for the past 6 years, I've been working with a wide range of materials in order to find a footing in a way of working that then I can use to focus specifically on maybe more permanent, if you will, materials, or more permanent, less temporary structures. Yeah. Oh, and I guess actually, I forgot one, is wax. Right now, what I'm doing is I'm trying to find ways to model phase-changing structures in controlled and comfortable environments like this, where you don't have to be wearing a Canada Goose coat. And what I've done is I'm starting to build a heat table that is basically an engine parts breakdown table that I'm using a engine block heater underneath it with a rheostat to basically heat this metal table and fill it with paraffin wax, and use an infrastructure to use ropes and fiberglass poles to build temporary wax fabric structures, and then turn off the table, let it cool and solidify, and then when I'm ready to try another form, to turn the table on and let that melt down and start again. But the idea of that is that this becomes an analog way of working in a full-scale condition for the ice, for example, or a concrete or a spraycrete. So that's another one that I'm starting with now.
Going back to the situationist map and thinking about conveying experiences, these materials that you're working with have an embodied knowledge in them, but how do you convey that to the viewer?
The materials themselves?
Yeah, so sort of like how Victoria was standing on the piece of sheet metal, and how she was learning through the act of doing, through actually learning about the material itself. But in most of the installations, unless you're actually the maker, and you're not learning about like how these things are put together. So I guess the question is how, just as a situationist, we're trying to convey their experience in the city. How do you convey the knowledge that you're gaining through these materials being built?
It's a fantastic question. That's something that I struggle with, and that actually I find that is one of those mysteries of the design process that I'm really excited to be engaging and trying to figure out, as I think all of us should be trying to figure that one out in particular. But what I've found are a couple modes of working. One is to work with materials that invite touch, that invite tactile engagement, like Victoria on that thing, or people touching the ice or breaking the ice or grabbing the wood and saying, this I understand is wood, this I understand is basically this and that, and I've seen this 1,000 times. But that it can be that, it can be this rigid cocoon or this strange form or whatnot, opens up perceptions about possibilities. Another one is through public engagement during the construction process, not shrouded by walls, not in the veil of night or something like that, but actually through invitation and through a tectonic language that invites interpretation. Very often we talk about architecture and the beauty of the detail, the fetish of the detail, but very often we're the only ones that are fetishizing about that detail because we're the only ones that understand what's inside that detail and how hard it is to make that detail. Architecture also can be incredibly simple and seductive, and each of these projects so far I've been trying to use off-the-shelf stuff. So with, for example, the fiberglass, I use gear clamps or hose clamps to bind the rebar together. Ping pong balls behind the fabric, slip knots and ropes, ground anchors to hold tents down. Stuff like that is super rudimentary, but how they're used is an invitation to experience in a new way. But that's so far what I've found. Another one I think is the way that structures behave dynamically. I think watching them behave, seeing them break perception, saying that structures shouldn't move this much, but it's not catastrophically failing. That is also an invitation to kind of try to understand a structure. But I don't want to skirt around the question. I actually agree with you. I think that there is a much richer way to engage with a community or to invite engagement through some other range of experiences in architecture that I really would like to try to find in the work. So it's something that I don't have an answer for, but it's something I'm very interested to find the answer for, or at least one answer for, and I don't think there's one way for sure.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to, I was kind of thinking the same thing to Alex, but you kind of answered it. But as far as once you install these and sort of they're out in the environment, do you go through a process of recording or sort of observing how people actually interact? Because I know there was one on the skating rink and people are making funny sounds and stuff. Do you actually observe that and see how they're reacting to these piece that you put out there.
Could you repeat the question?
Thank you. Yeah, the question was, do I actually spend time observing and experiencing the event of the architecture behaving? You know, people experiencing it, going through it, touching it, making noises and things like that. Yes, I do. A lot of the projects that I work with, I'm almost always there, at least as much as I can be. I wasn't on the site on the ice for 42 days, but I was there as much as I could. And actually, I think you're right. I think that that's actually a really interesting clue to the question previous, which is about how to engage people, because they will themselves intuitively, as I tried to describe at the beginning of the lecture, describe what they are desiring to know. So yeah, absolutely. And in fact, that's the pleasure. That's the real reward in this kind of work, is that it's not the thing, it's just what manifests, the ripple effects in people, you know, watching them kind of grapple with, like, what in the hell is ice? Like, how is ice that, you know? And things like that. But I think that that's just the beginning, and I think that finding ways to observe that in ways that I can then respond to is a really helpful question.
For me, that lens into this that's really powerful is your diagram about, rather than starting from a statement of form leading to questions about material or what it might be, starting with the question and the material and allowing that to move towards the statement of form is. So I'm curious about how there's a lot on the front end of framing that question. But there's the material, which is a given, a lot of times by the situation. But the intelligence with which you approach and frame the question is fairly sophisticated. Are there certain parameters to break down that? What makes a good question, whether it's a structural question or a technology question or a spatial question?
Right. So the question was, what sort of precedes the catalyst that sets the other moves into play, if you will, or the conversation between materials and making? Yeah, good question. Intuition. Yeah, every time. And that's, I mean, it's not, I'm not trying to, I don't mean to say that to be arrogant or something. It's not meant to dismiss. But each of us has that ability, and that's what we do. I mean, a lot of us are afraid to admit it, I think, but it's not something to be ashamed of. It's actually something that we need to acknowledge and recognize that that's actually been the way of working for many centuries before. You know, we didn't just come up with AutoCAD and suddenly figure out how to build something. And that drawings somehow are the things that go out for tender have always been the way that things have been built. It's not the case. The question that sets a chain of events in motion. Understanding the community that we're working in is a very big question. So for example, the D-Wall project of building the scaffolding, you know, we knew we wanted to touch the building. We knew this is an amazing structure. I mean, one of the initial ideas for the gallery was to actually take one of those columns and temporarily prop it up, cut a section of that column away and cast a blob in the middle and then let it go and then let it be reset and realize, okay, intuition doesn't always work. So we realized that we wanted to touch the building in another way that would allow people to try to understand that there is another way of touching that is not about an assembly or an accumulation of material that builds something up. That sometimes we can work with what's already been taken away, like a gap, like a space. And that question is what helped us understand, okay, well, we think we're going to put some sticks in these cracks, so we'll try to cut them to about that size. Then that led to us bringing it down, and then I'd never hammered a stick into a crack of a ceiling before. But when we started doing it, it's like, oh my God, it pings. It's like a nail. It just bing, 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 like this. And I was shocked because I thought it would, you know, smash the end, splinter away, crack, you know, and it didn't do that. It was a solid nail. And I'm like, holy crap, we're building with nails. So we started to do it more and more, and then we say, okay, we're going to pull them in. We're going to pull them into each other because the beam in the middle is where these vertical pieces are coming down, and we can do something that kind of grows from that, right? And it's an active conversation during that process. That's why we photographed the series of photos and invited people to kind of engage that process. The question, getting back to it, has to be about intuition. It cannot only be about the brain. It's not just about the mind. It cannot only be that. Our lives are much more rich than an intellectual engagement with the things we make. It is just not possible, in my opinion. So I would say that it's something I can't give you a straight answer for, but it absolutely has to do with trying to be conscious and aware and intensely curious about what we're about to embark on. And that's kind of where we start. Yes, Dan.
Question about the language that develops because of the material itself and how your intuition or the material's intuition lines up. Because I can, one of the biggest things that you're trying to talk about is how the material develops itself almost, how the force involved develops itself. But I can see a language starting to develop. And do you consciously maybe attack that language because maybe you're actually doing things intuitively for yourself versus the material sometimes? It kind of carries, one project carries over to another that aren't really related. Do you ever do things to attack that and pull someone else in? Say, do something to it, change it up. How do you attack that developing language, which I guess is one of the main points of the lecture?
Okay. So the question is, how do you challenge the material or pattern language that emerges from these projects in a way that either doesn't become habitual or repeated, or is somehow evolved in some way, if I understand correctly? It's a very good question. I definitely work with people on the projects, like, for example, the animation of the structure, the fiberglass being constructed, that was done with Chad Connery, one of the student volunteers, and sometimes I work with research assistants, and we always discuss these things. Mark West and I constantly have conversations. Ronnie Arai and I also have conversations all the time and so forth. So it is about a discussion of what's happening in the design process that helps to help me to interpret the pattern language. So I think that's important, is the question about how we interpret the languages that are emerging, and I think that's kind of what you're suggesting. As far as displacing or destabilizing my comfort, perhaps, with a language that might be emerging, I find that the material itself really dislodges that by itself. If wood doesn't want to do something, it's not going to do it, and same with ice, and the same with wax, and the same with everything else. But what I'm finding, though, is that there is a common universality to these languages that is emerging that I don't have a lot of control of, but actually is the thing that is working in each of these projects. So that's kind of what I was talking about earlier, that's something I'm trying to understand. That being said, I actually am very interested in the idea of disrupting a homogeneous, harmonious, we'll say, pattern language, because besides it looking like it came from, I don't know, Avatar or something like that, where everything is fantastic and, everybody plugs into these structures or something, it's actually, I believe that the structure's ability to behave should allow them to adapt to disruption. And it's in that grafting of a new solution to a new problem that will help to also teach us about how these patterns are, what's genuine about them, what's actually universal in them, and what's also perhaps part of my preconception about what it should be, or something like that. So how I invite that, I would argue, is in the lab constantly. Whatever we make, we break. And frankly, that's an old school method, and that always works. As far as the pattern languages, I think the questions of, for example, this swarm project, where I'm trying to ask, how do I draw again, and say, how can a drawing actually participate in this kind of work, is something I don't know the answer to, and that's a disruption for me. So it also charges me to say, well, how do I make a structure that can be a drawing? Suddenly that's like a complete disruption of where I was comfortable before, for example. So, and I think also it's about hybridizing projects. The Cocoon project is a hybridization of the curtain wall and the On the Road project. The wood project is putting myself in a position where the D-Raw project, where I don't know what's coming out of this project, right? But we start with 2 things or something like that. So in a way, each project is kind of a disruption, but I know what you're saying, and I don't really have a good answer for you. But those are some strategies that I think I try to work with anyway.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
I was just curious about what type of fabric you used and if you experimented with different types of fabrics.
Do you have a hoodie?
Yes.
Okay, that's what I used.
Okay.
We tested a range of materials. We tried 100% natural fibers to 100% synthetic fibers, and we found that actually high natural content of fibers hold the most water, but high synthetic fibers actually create some of the thickest layers, and a hoodie does that very well. So one side is a woven knit cotton, and the other side is this non-woven fabric that's extruded from it. So what happens is that creates a very 90% cotton creates a very high water retention capacity, but the thickness of that fuzzy layer actually creates a perfect material to stick ice to. So we put the fuzzy side out on the Cocoon project, and we sprayed that thing with water, and when that ice stuck, we weren't afraid of the ice breaking and shattering and falling to the ground because it was embedded in the hairs of the fabric. So that's what we used, and it was cheap. That's the other very important thing.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.